Here we can see a line at the position of the sleeve material. We draw it on the front side of the fabric. After drawing this line on the front side, we directly fold this line to the back side like this. Use an iron to press the crease flat. Then we sew a 1mm line on the front side to fix it. After fixing it, we unfold it like this. After unfolding, the place where we just sewed forms a fold. We fold this crease downwards towards the bottom edge. Again, use an iron to press it flat. Then using this fold, which is the crease we just made, as a reference point, we draw a 5mm line upwards. After drawing the line, we repeat the previous steps to fold this line in half. After folding and ironing it flat, we also draw a 1mm line on the front at this position. After drawing the line, we repeat the previous steps. First, unfold the sleeve like this, then fold it towards the bottom edge. Similarly, iron it flat. Repeat the previous steps. 5mm above the crease we just made, draw another line. Repeat the previous steps. We will make 4 such folds. Here we will join the edge trimming. After drawing it according to the dimensions on the blueprint, leave a 1 cm seam on the long side. I have already folded and ironed it. That is, before folding, this dimension is 2 cm wider than the width on our blueprint. For the style of the short sides, it is normal to leave 5 mm. We have drawn it out here. Next, we will add a layer of lace trim to the front of this drawn edge. The width of the lace trim is about the same as the width of the folded bottom part. Directly apply it along the style line. Then we align the bottom edge of the sleeve with the front of the drawn edge we just processed. The style line of the bottom edge aligns perfectly with the line where we just added the trim. Then we sew it directly. After sewing, we turn the drawn edge to the front. Here we sew a line at least 4 mm from the bottom edge of the sleeve. Here we need to sew a channel for the elastic band. After sewing, it looks like this. At this position, I sew a line. Here we need to insert the elastic band. Before inserting the elastic band, we need to sew the gathering stitch on top. For the gathering stitch here, do not backstitch at the beginning and end. The stitch length I use is 4, and the thread ends should be left a bit longer. At 2 mm to the left and 2 mm to the right of the seam line, we sew a gathering stitch on each side. There is also the position where the 2 sides are folded. You can sew a line at this position, slightly towards the side. If you don't sew it, it will be very easy for the fold to move up when we join the 2 sides together, or some parts may be pulled unevenly and be more open. At this point, we will thread the elastic band through the bottom edge. I used a lot of effort to thread the elastic band here, since I don't have such small tools. You can use other pins as well as long as they can go through the elastic band. The size of the elastic band is given as a reference value on the drawing. You can also adjust it according to your own gas volume. At this point, we will finally remove the part with the drawn pleats on top. Pull out the pleat. While drawing the pleats, tighten the 2 bottom lines. After drawing the pleats, we will set this part aside for now. Here, we will talk about the colored pieces on the lower half of the skirt. One reason is that the fabric I used is relatively dark in color. Then the colored pieces are also relatively large. So here I cut a separate piece of white fabric for it to demonstrate for everyone. If the normal skirt hem is very long, both sides extend outward. Like this here, I cut a middle section to demonstrate the upper part is the waistband. Here I will write a word to mark it. Then on our pattern, I also drew a diagram of this pleat as an illustration. Diagram of the skirt pleats. We follow the dimensions marked on that diagram. Draw 2 lines on this. For the top and bottom positions, we have a double thread. Then we wrote down the spacing of this position. How much is the specific spacing? You just use a ruler to draw the lines according to your own drawing. Then we fold the position of the first line like this. The folded part is the reverse side. The side facing up is the front side. The waistband part faces up. Then we directly sew along the edge. Fix it in place at a distance of 1 mm. Make sure the waistband side is facing up. This way, the stitching we do after ironing it later. This line will be the front side. After finishing, we pull the fabric up and down, spread it out like this. Fold the sewn pleat down towards the bottom edge. Use an iron to press it flat. The top fold is relatively simple because there is only one. Then mainly deal with the second fold line. For this line, we need 4 folds here. Fold from bottom to top. First, fold the marked position at the bottom in the same way. You can use an iron to press it flat first. Then also with the waistband side facing up. At the edge, 1 mm inward. Secure the fold with a stitch. After measuring, we unfold this part in the same way. Fold this direction down towards the bottom edge. Use an iron to press it flat, then at the position of the horizontal fold, using the edge as a reference. We draw a 5 mm line upwards. After drawing this line, repeat the previous steps. First, fold it properly. Then remove the thread. After each measurement, we fold the direction of the crease down towards the bottom edge and press it flat. Then continue to draw lines upwards. Continue to fold. We make a total of 4 folds at this position, plus 1 separate fold above, making a total of 5 folds. The lower part of the skirt, with the folds properly made, looks like this. Here, we first fold up the part where the bottom edge is joined according to the dimensions given on the pattern. Then add a 5 mm seam allowance all around. After cutting, we fold it in half and iron it. Then we align the style of the splicing part with the style at the bottom. Directly sew along the upper and lower style lines. This is with the front sides facing each other. After sewing, we turn the spliced part to the front. The style at the bottom is facing the left-hand side. Directly sew a pleat at the bottom edge of the skirt to fix it. Next, we use a ruler to measure the position of the white edge, and the position of the nearest pleat next to it. In the middle, its size, for example, if you measure it to be 4, then we draw a straight line at the halfway point, which is 2. Specifically, measure how much it is, you follow your own measurements. Anyway, draw the line at the halfway point, take out the finished folded eyelashes, and draw the edge. Then we align the position of the line on the edge of the eyelashes with the line we just drew at the bottom, and sew it directly. Here, let me mention in passing that this step is something I do at the very end. But actually, you should complete this step in advance because I only remembered after finishing the fold and aligning it with the top. I kind of forgot we should definitely sew it on right from the start. Because at this point, the fabric is relatively flat if you sew it later like I did. It has already been folded. The fabric is not that smooth. If it's not smooth, it will be more troublesome to sew the edges. The operation will be a bit more difficult. Next, we'll fold this part towards the waistband. When folding, do not backstitch because this part is relatively longer. Here, I am using a size 5 thread. On the left and right sides of this style line, sew a gathering stitch 2 millimeters away on each side. Then, simultaneously pull the 2 bottom threads to gather the fabric. When one side feels tight, switch to the other side and gather. After gathering the fabric, we need to adjust the size so that it matches the length of the bottom edge of the skirt's upper part. After adjusting it properly, we will sew them together with the front sides facing each other. After sewing, check by yourself if there are any issues. If there are no issues, you can remove the basting stitches we just made. Then we unfold the upper and lower parts. Fold the bottom seam towards the left-hand side. Sew a top stitch to make this position flatter. Then we proceed with the upper part. The waistband of this skirt should also be gathered using double stitching for gathering. After gathering, the size should match the rising part of our skirt. The size of the bottom edge should be consistent. After adjusting, set it aside for now. For the flutter sleeve part first, take a piece of fabric and fold it like this. Iron the folded edge flat. Then take the pattern piece for the flutter sleeve. Align this straight line with the position of the fold. Draw this curved line. Then for this curved edge, leave a 5 millimeters gap to cut it off. Repeat the steps. We need 2 such flutter sleeves here. Then we will respectively gather these 2 flutter sleeves. Gather the thread along the red line we just drew. On both sides of this line, 2 millimeters each side. Do not backstitch. First, loosen it a bit. Here I am using 4. Simultaneously tighten the 2 bottom lines. Pull out this pleat. If one side feels tighter, switch to the other side and pull. After both pleats are pulled out, we will set them aside for now. Here we will work on the front and back pieces of the outer part. Face each other. Stitch the dart position. After measuring, we will unfold the front and back pieces. The style at the dart position will be split to both sides. Then repeat the steps. Handle the front and back pieces of the lining. In the same way, the processed lining and outer parts will look like this. Then we need to add lace around the neckline. For the lace here, I used elastic lace. Then at the starting position of the lace, we fold it back by 5 millimeters like this. Align the folded edge. With our style line, sew it along the style line around our neckline. When you are about 2 centimeters away from the final position, stop for now. Elastic lace. We first cut off the excess part of this fabric, then fold it back by 5 millimeters. This way, it will be perfectly aligned with our final seam line on the edge. Pay attention to the beginning and the end. We fold them upwards. The lace is also attached to the front side of this fabric. Then we first go around the neckline and make a few straight cuts, inward. Do not use the lace scissors. If you use lace scissors to cut the buttonholes, this elastic lace, it will easily come apart in the end. Then take out the ceremonial cloth we prepared earlier. Place the ceremonial cloth and the outer fabric right sides together, like this. Sew around the neckline. After finishing the neckline, let's take a look at the flutter sleeve part. There is a marking point on both the front and back pieces of our pattern. This marking point, we make it on the front side of the fabric. There is a marking point on both the front and back. This marking point is where our flutter sleeve starts. Align the position. Pull up the flutter sleeve on both sides along the upper and lower style lines. After gathering the flutter sleeves on both sides, we then attach the sleeve. We have gathered the pleats in the front. Adjust this pleat to match the size of the armhole. You can manually compare it first. If it matches, there is no problem. We will directly fold it up with the front sides facing each other. After measuring, remove the basting stitches. The other sleeve follows the same method. After both sleeves are done, we will orient the style of the sleeve position towards the body. Just don't measure towards the direction of the sleeve. Measure the marking line. Fix the direction of this flying sleeve. If it is not fixed, sometimes when you wear it, the direction of this flying sleeve will reverse, because depending on the style, this direction will follow to the other side. Then we will take the front and back pieces of the garment and place them face to face. Sew this side seam position. The other side is also the front and back pieces of the Ministry of Rights. Sew this side seam position with the right sides facing each other. Then sew this side seam of the outer part and the sleeves, also with the right sides facing each other. Measure the position below the page. Make some notches here for the direction. Then use the same method. Sew this side seam on the other side and the sleeves. After pinning them, we turn the garment to the right side. Set it aside for now. The outer hem of the pinned part needs to be sewn together with the bottom edge of the upper part's outer side, so their sizes need to be adjusted to match. After adjusting, we sew them together with the right sides facing each other. Sew along the top and bottom edges. In the middle, we encountered a position with a seam and we split it to both sides. After arranging it properly, check if there are any issues. If there are no issues, remove the basting thread. We also need to add a layer of hem to the lining. For the lining's hem, I used mesh fabric. The bottom edge of the mesh fabric does not need to be hemmed. So regarding the size of this mesh fabric, under normal circumstances, we add a 5mm seam allowance. The bottom edge does not need a seam allowance. Similarly, use double threads to gather the waistband part. Gather and fold. After gathering and folding, sew it together with the lining of the upper part, right sides facing each other. The finished outer and lining parts, only the collar part is sewn together. Now we will measure the waistband positions separately. Measure and fix with top stitching. When measuring the top stitching, the seam allowances underneath should face towards the neckline. Then we align the lining and the outer fabric with their right sides facing each other, and sew directly to the bottom of the skirt. You will notice that the mesh fabric inside is shorter than the outer skirt by a section. This is not a problem. You just need to measure up to where the mesh fabric ends. The back opening on the other side is the same. After measuring everything, we will see that the topmost position has a right angle style. Trim this area diagonally. I have disassembled this part before. Actually, I have already trimmed this part. Then here we take a look at the colored pieces section. First is this ceremonial cloth. For the ceremonial cloth, we use a one-piece drawing method, which means we combine the front and back seam points and draw them together. After drawing, leave a 5mm seam allowance and cut it out. Next is the opening position at the back, which might be a bit narrow. Here, just like I am doing, cut straight inward and it will be fine. After we finish sewing the back opening, the top part here is slanted. This sewing area also needs to be trimmed off, so it's okay if this part is a little less. The neckline here also leaves a normal 5mm seam allowance. After trimming, it looks like this. This is the lining fabric for the front and back pieces of our dress. It is 80 count. If it is 60 count, it does not need to be ironed. After we draw it like this on both sides. Additionally, take another piece of fabric. After sewing the two pieces of fabric together, with the right sides facing each other, you can trim it. The upper and lower pieces of fabric are both made of 80 count high thread cotton that I ironed. Then there's this colorful piece at the waist. We need to make 6 decorative strips on the waist. The positions of the 6 decorative strips, we just need to draw them according to the positions on the pattern exactly as they are. Then, at the top, there are 2 marking points which also need to be made. Here, both the lining and the outer fabric are ironed with a scale because, like the collar, they are made of 80 count high thread cotton, which is a bit thin. A regular thin summer scale will do, just to add a little thickness. Then there's the hem of this dress. This part is larger because of the pattern, so I have divided it into 2 parts. We need to join them together, like this. The joining position is at the location of these 2 black short lines. Just align this edge. Then, as for this diagram, it has front and back labeled. Mine doesn't have it labeled, but the diagram you received has it labeled. The selected position is the front and the back position is the rear. The side with the opening at the back. If you remember this pattern, we need to draw it symmetrically to balance the scale. Here we will make a decorative strip for the waist. On the far left side here, I have already done it. There are a total of 6 such decorative strips. We will draw them all according to the positions on the pattern. This is drawn on the front side of the fabric. Then we cut a strip of fabric with a width of at least 2 centimeters. 3 millimeters from the edge of the fabric, we draw a line. Draw a straight line down. Like I did, align this line with the red line at this position. So directly along the line after finishing, we trim off the excess part. You can cut a little to the side, don't cut it too precisely. After we finish handling everything, we will trim again, then fold this part to the right like this, using the fold balance position as a reference. We draw a line to the side. The distance of this line is the same as the distance between these 2 red lines. Below, after drawing, we fold this line down. After folding, at a position about 3 millimeters away from the fold balance, we trim off the excess part. After trimming, we align this fold balance position with the position of the red line next to it. Press a line directly. Fix it here at this point. We can trim off the excess fabric edge along the edge of the fabric. Then the position on the other side of this fabric strip. Also remove the visible thread, symmetrical on both sides. After removing, it looks like this. Then we repeat this method. Handle the remaining parts as well. Next, let's deal with the inner part of the waist. Here we need to talk about the bottom part. Sew along this line. Fold inward towards the reverse side. Iron it to set the shape. In the middle of this position, we just fold one side over the other to form a sharp angle like this. After ironing, the front and back look like this. Then we set this part aside for now. Here we need to work on the front piece. The front piece needs to be folded and sewn. The length and width of the bottom fabric should be slightly larger than the pattern above. The 2 lines in the very middle, just follow the 2 lines on our previous piece to draw. Then we go to both sides separately. Draw a line every 3 millimeters, including the 2 lines we just drew. There are a total of 6 lines on one side. There are a total of 12 lines on both sides. The lines in the middle are these 2. I'll make a mark first. First, fold one of the lines. Fold it towards the back side of the fabric. If you use a small amount of water, you can iron it directly. If you use a hot pen, just like I do, scrape it with your fingernail. Otherwise, if the thread machine burns it off, it will be gone. Take the folded line and align it with the adjacent line. Align the crease with the red line below. We directly measure 1 millimeter of the marking line to fix it. Next, we fold the line next to it, also folding it towards the back side of the fabric. After folding it similarly, fold the line next to it. Press it over like this. Measure a 1 millimeter marking line to fix it. Then repeat the steps, fold the line next to it, then continue measuring this fold. This way, we have 3 folds on one side. It has already been measured. Then we use the same method to measure all 3 folds on this side. After measuring all the folds, it looks like this. Then we take out this diagram again. Align the middle position with these 2 folds in the middle. Trace the edge of the diagram. Before cutting it out, we will do one more step. Next to the position of the fold, this line that was just drawn about 2 millimeters away, we measure align the neckline here as well. The main purpose here is because of this fold. If you don't fix it when we perform other operations later, it's very easy to pull this part apart. Then we normally leave a 5 millimeter margin. Cut out this pattern. After cutting it out, it is now a normal front piece. Here we will work on the collar part. As for the collar, because I used this relatively thin fabric, it also has an iron-on interfacing. If you are using a thickness of 60, you don't need to use the interfacing, but if you used 80 like I did, it is best to iron the scale. The front sides of the 2 layers of fabric should face each other. This kind of sharp words. There is a corner here at the back and front, the position of the corner, but we need to put a thread inside, so that when we turn it over at the end, the corner position will look more aesthetic. The video for placing the thread, we have it separately in the folder. You can take a look if you don't know how to do it. Before laying the thread, we first separate and cut the fabric of the 2 collars. This way it will be easier to lay the thread. At the beginning and end, we extend a 5 millimeter seam allowance outward. The shorter curved line does not need a seam allowance. All other positions need a seam allowance. After finishing, we tuck the inserted thread inside a bit. We need to trim this side. Be careful not to cut the thread where there is no seam. We leave a 5 millimeter seam allowance. For other areas, we can leave just 2 to 3 millimeters. For curved areas, use pinking shears to trim. If you don't have pinking shears, use regular scissors to make some notches. The position of the 2 lines, the seam next to it, we will trim the shoes like this. But be careful not to cut the thread we put in. After removing it, we turn it to the front, iron it flat. If sisters like the exposed thread, you can remove the thread again. For a regular car, the starting position might be a bit difficult to maneuver. We can take a piece of scrap material and fold it a few times until it is almost level with the fabric of our collar. Place it behind the presser foot. This way, it will move more smoothly when we start. Even at the corners, we can place a bit of material in front to lift it up. The other collar should be handled in the same way. Everyone, please repeat the steps yourselves. Here's the apron part. We first mark the middle point at the top, which is the indented position. Make a mark there. We don't draw on the front side of the fabric because for this step, we need to attach the lace first. The lace should be attached on the front side of the fabric so that it is more visible. The alignment of the machine is relatively accurate. The top part with the microfont does not have lace. We will sew along the lines for the rest of the positions. Here, I am using pleated eyelash lace. It has pleating lines on it. The position of our pleating lines should align with the marked line below. Then sew directly along this line with the machine. The outer edge of the lace should face left. The style should face right, face to face. This is the beginning and the end. We all extend outward by a 5 millimeter seam allowance. After eating well, we directly take a piece of mesh fabric and cover it on top. When removing, the fabric with the lace we just sewed should face up. Change the direction. Along the line where we just sewed the lace, sew it again. After measuring, use pinking shears to trim the edges, then turn it directly to the front side. Iron it flat stitch along the edge with a top stitch. Then, at the topmost position, remove the basting thread at this position, 2 millimeters to the left and right of the seam. Stitch a basting thread on each side. Do not backstitch at the beginning and end. Here, I used a stitch length of 4. Leave both ends of the thread longer. After setting it up, we simultaneously tighten the 2 bottom lines. To form this pleat, after pulling the pleat, set it aside for now. Here, let's take a look at the hem of this skirt. Here we take the 2 patterns, combine pattern 1 and pattern 2 together. After drawing, it looks like this. The position on top is not removed. Then we go down from this position, and then pass through this winding place. Go up here at the beginning and the end, extend outward by 5 millimeters, just like the apron. We cover it with a piece of mesh fabric and sew it together. When sewing, we can place the mesh fabric underneath. As long as the front sides are facing each other, it will be fine. Because the mesh fabric sometimes deforms easily, when removed, we use the original outer fabric to place on top. It will be easier to remove at the pointed corners on both sides. We put a thread inside for those who don't know how to put the thread. You can check there is a separate video for threading in the folder. After finishing, we trim it a bit. Use a curved edge scissors for the curved areas. If you don't have curved edge scissors, use regular scissors to make some notches. For the area without stitching, we leave a 5 millimeter seam allowance. After trimming, it looks like this. Then we trim the 2 sharp corners where we marked earlier. Trim the seam allowance here a bit. Be careful. Do not cut the thread we have inside. After handling it, flip it directly to the front side, smooth it out. Sew along the edge, top stitch. After finishing both skirts, it looks like this. Let's compare it ourselves. Check if there are any mistakes. First, it is drawn left and right. Both sides are symmetrical. You can mark the front position like I did. Do not make both sides exactly the same. We need it to be symmetrical, with the left and right sides being symmetrical. After everything is handled, we shake our heads below. That is at the position where there is no stitching in the front. Pull the thread out. Pull the thread in this style. First, set a line on each side, 2 millimeters from the left and right. Do not reverse the front and back. The stitch length I used here is 4. Leave both ends of the thread longer, after removing. Simultaneously tighten the 2 bottom threads. Pull out this fold, then set it aside for now. Here we take the processed front and back pieces, align them with the right sides facing each other. Sew the dart position. After removing, press the seam allowances of the dart open to both sides. You can use an iron to press and shape it. Then we will apply this eyelash lace on the front of this front and back piece. This eyelash lace is pre-folded, so on the top, there is definitely only one seam. Align the seam position and sew it directly onto the red guideline below. The exposed part of the lace should face left. The right side is a style of lace. The other side is also done in the same way. Measure the lace on it. After both sides of the lace are done, let's work on this collar. First, find the front neckline. The position of the center line here. Make a mark on it. The position at the back is the mark point on the back of our pattern. Also make it. Then align the back of the collar to this position. Align the front to this position. Directly measure the seam along the upper and lower lines. After measuring, we will first make some reductions around the neckline. Then we take out the lining. The lining and the outer fabric overlap them together like this. Sew upwards from this position. Go around the neckline. Go down from here, and both sides here also need to be sewn. Only this position, and down here. This position does not need to be sewn. The remaining positions need to be sewn. When sewing, the right sides should be facing each other, but we can place the outer fabric on the top layer to make it easier for us later to follow the previously sewn line. And sew directly along it. It will be more accurate this way. Then the positions we just sewed should all be notched at the seam allowances. The seam at the right angle position, trim it diagonally like this. Then we use straight hemostats from this front position, from the tip seam backward. Move the back piece like this. Clamp the back piece over. Through this position of the tip seam, pull it over. Both sides follow the same procedure. After flipping it over, we iron it flat. We measure the seam we just sewed and measure it flat to make it smoother. For the collar, fold it down like this, then iron it. Then we take out the waist part. Let's look at the waist part. There are 2 marking points here. These 2 markers should align with the positions of the 2 edges on the front piece. Excluding the lace on both sides, it's the edge of the fabric itself. Sew them together with the right sides facing each other. Then let's look at the position of the back piece. We just turn it over like this, without any twists in the middle. It just bends over a bit like this at the very edge, align with the outermost seam line. Then similarly, follow the seam line up and down. Just sew it directly to secure it. Similarly, the back piece here, just fold it over like this. Align the edges and sew along the seam line. After measuring, we do a check. Just flip it to its normal front-facing state, like this. Check if the front and back positions are correct. Don't wait until it turns in the middle and twists, then the shoulder area won't be smooth. If there are no issues, let's first put on the apron below. Align the edges of the apron, with the edges on both sides here. The edge position of the apron mentioned here does not include the selvage on both sides. It refers to the edge of the fabric itself. Also, the center point of our apron, that I taught you to make at the beginning, is this indented position, which aligns with the tip above when sewing. Make sure to align it here. We are also sewing with the right sides facing each other after sewing. Turn it to the right side and check if it is aligned. If there are no issues, then remove the gathering from the apron, and we do the same at the bottom edge of the waist area. Let's work on the hem part of this skirt. The hem has a front and back direction. Please pay attention to this. For the back, it aligns with the direction of the back opening. So our 2 hems are divided by the central pointed position. The edges align with this point. Originally, on this side, our fabric has a seam. Do not align with the very edge of the seat seam. Align with the seat seam line. This is aligned with the seat seam line. Here, we will align the bottom edge of the waist with the front of our skirt hem. The position marked front on the skirt hem is aligned with this point. When turned to the front, it looks like this. Please check yourself if there are any issues. If there are no issues, just remove the stitching on the hem of the skirt. Then we guide the seam at the bottom edge of the waist towards the neckline. At this position, on the bottom edge of the waist, measure the entire line. After measuring, the waist is here, we fold the upper part back like this, press it down like this. First, take out the lining of the waist and overlap it with it. Except for the bottom edge that is folded in, do not measure and sew. For other positions, we directly measure and sew along the top and bottom. When sewing the 2 side edges, note that we need to sew close to the edge of the upper part. Do not pull the fabric of the upper part away, just clamp it in the middle. After measuring, we slightly trim the seam at the straight positions on both sides. When the shoe is trimmed, then turn over the waist area. Use tweezers to assist a bit. After folding both sides, the edge should look like this. Then let's look at the bottom edge of the lining on the reverse side. Here we will use the long stitch method to sew this bottom edge to the seam line of the skirt hem. Using the sewing machine, we will sew it together using the long stitch method. Sisters who don't know the long stitch method can check the folder. There is a separate tutorial for the long stitch method. Finally, along the position we sewed before, measure all the edges with a visible line. Lastly, let me talk about the back. I am using eyelets. If your body type is relatively slim, then you don't need to use eyelets. Just use Velcro on both sides or use hidden buttons to fasten it. But if your size is similar to mine, or if you are even larger with a bigger size, then let's try to use this air eye at the back. Otherwise, here we take a look at part of faku first. We follow the dimensions given on the drawing and prepare 2 pieces of lace like this. As for this lace, each dimension is different. That is to say, for some dimensions, the 2 pieces of lace have the same width and the same length. But for some, the width is the same. Some widths are different. If the lace on your drawing has different widths, meaning it's a bit narrower, this is the front, which is the forehead area. This can be distinguished like the one I'm making now. It is the same. If it is the same, we just follow a 5mm edge, do the stitching directly to measure the seam. The given size of this lace includes the seam. So for this stitching, we measure approximately 5mm ourselves. If the 2 widths are different, still, sew with the right sides facing each other. Align this stitching. That means one side of the lace will be narrower and the other side will be wider. After measuring, we trim the seam. Leave about 3mm. Then we will split this seam to both sides. Iron it with an iron from the leftmost side of the front. We measure 3 centimeters inward, draw a line, then using this line as a reference, draw a line every 7mm. Draw lines to fill the entire fabric strip. This is what it looks like after drawing all the lines. Then we fold it, starting from the first line here. We fold it towards the back, like this. Along this line, this is the first line, then we skip 2 lines, which are the second and third lines, and fold the 4th line, then skip 2 lines again. Just skip the 5th and 6th folds. The 7th line means that every time we fold, we need to leave 2 lines in between before folding the next line. After folding all the lines that need to be folded, we can then remove this fold. The position of the first line, fold. Align it with the 3rd line and press it over like this. Align the 4th line and the 6th line and press it over like this. Following the style position where the 2 lace edges are joined, sew them directly to fix them. The exact number of folds needed is written on the pattern. You can take a look and count them yourself. After measuring, there will definitely be an extra piece. Here we have provided a first-class dimension. Starting from the left, this is the position of our first line. It counts as the first fold. Then moving to the right, count them in order. Our drawing indicates the number of folds, so this side needs that many folds. If there are fewer folds, then you need to add some. When there are too many cars, you can remove some. From the right side, we have a relatively long extra part here. Let's trim it here. Using the edge of the fold on the far side as a reference measure, 2 centimeters to the right, draw a line here. Then along this line, trim off the excess part. After trimming, we will draw lines inward from both ends. Draw the first line 5mm inward from the edge of the fabric. Then draw the second line another 5mm inward. Both sides are the same. Then we choose this type of lace with holes in the middle. The width of this lace is approximately 1.7 centimeters. Place it on the front side of the band at the bottom. The center of the lace and the position where the 2 laces at the bottom join are perfectly aligned. At the beginning position, we apply a small amount of glue, or you can use the kind that you pour from a faucet. We first use glue to slightly fix the beginning position. Be careful not to apply glue to the area with a hole in the middle. We apply it to both sides of the lace. Then we follow the fabric underneath. Didn't we just draw a 2 to 5mm line? Fold it for the first time. Fold the first 5mm to the reverse side. Fold the second 5mm, which is equivalent to tucking in the raw edge. Fold the edge after folding. We sew a line to fix this position. We haven't trimmed the lace on the other end yet. Here, we do it like before now at the edge of this fabric. Apply a little glue on both sides. First, fix the edge. Try to make the middle part as flat as possible. Not too tight and not too loose. Just make it smooth. After sticking it well at this position, we will trim off the excess lace. The excess lace at the bottom edge of the fabric. After trimming, we will also fold this position twice. Just follow the 2 5mm lines and fold it twice, towards the reverse side. Sew a line to fix it in place. It's the same as the one just now. After fixing both ends, we apply a little bit of glue to the edges of the lace in the middle part to temporarily fix it as well. The reason we don't sew it directly here is because we will sew it on the reverse side later. If we sew it on the front side now, the stitching will be more chaotic and messy later. Of course, if you don't mind, you can also sew the line directly. If you don't want too many lines, you can follow my steps. Then we prepare a strip of fabric like this. Using fabric of 60 units is enough. Its length is about the same as the length below, and the width is 3 centimeters. Fold the long edge of the fabric inward by 5 millimeters and draw a line. Fold both ends inward. Fold twice. Fold once at every 3 millimeters. Similarly, tuck in the raw edge. Then sew a line to secure it. The other end follows the same procedure. After sewing, set it aside for now. Then take a look at this part of our waistband. Let's first distinguish the front and back. The narrower part is the front, then the wider one is the back. But like mine, the front and back are the same width, so you can just choose one to be the back. It can't tell the difference. You can mark it yourself at the back position. Next, let's turn to the back of this method band. First, find the position where the two drawn edges are joined, this seam position. You can draw a line at this position like I did. Mark it out. Then we draw a line on each side of this line 5 millimeters away. After drawing, it looks like this. That is, the lines near the edge are about 1 centimeter apart. You can ignore the middle line. Then take the fabric strip we made earlier. Align it with the positions of these lines. Now the bottom edge is facing left. This is the position at the back. It is the position behind the French seam that we marked earlier, and also the strip of fabric we have now is slightly shorter than the bottom part. This is not a problem, as long as the starting and ending points are approximately the same short distance. Then we align the upper and lower seam positions and sew directly after sewing. We will fold it in the other direction. Fold it upwards, like this. Then we use the horizontal fold as a reference point. Measure a line upwards. This line is the distance between the two lines at the bottom, which is equal to the position of the strip above. Draw it out as well. After drawing it, fold this line downwards to the back after folding it. We use the position of this fold line as a reference. Leave a 3 millimeter seam allowance. Trim off the excess part. You can then iron the fold line we just made to make it flat, then fold it over to the other side like this to wrap the seam allowance in the middle. Sew a line directly to fix it here. After sewing, flip it over to this side and take a look. The two lines we just stitched on the car are just enough to secure both sides of the front lace. Then we use a separator to thread through from the bottom of this hole and pull the ribbon through. If you don't have this kind of separator, you can use a safety pin or something similar, as long as you can pull the ribbon through after threading it through. We secure both ends here with a tack stitch. The excess parts can be trimmed off. It's best to apply some edge sealer to the trimmed areas because ribbons can easily fray. Next, at these two ends, we will sew on 2 bows to cover up the marks. Then we will work on the back side of the lace. Make sure to identify the back side. We mentioned marking it at the beginning. We will follow along the bottom edge. This position does not adjust the edge. Fold it over to the front like this. Fold the edge inward by 1 millimeter completely to the line. Fix this position. Then take out the appropriate size of this type of grommet. This type of grommet, it can be made of metal or like this one that is already wrapped. You can decide whether to buy it or buy the materials and wrap it yourself. Then we pass it through this channel from the bottom. Like this, align it properly from left to right, then we can make a bow or other decorations on it according to our preference. This method is now complete. Let me explain here. When we usually make clothes, we often encounter some positions. It has a corner, so how do we handle the position of this corner to make it look more aesthetically pleasing after flipping it over? This kind of corner shape, it doesn't necessarily have to be a right angle. It could also be an acute angle or an obtuse angle. I'll roughly draw it here. When we usually encounter this kind of position, its angle size may be different, but we can all use the same method to operate it. Then, flip it over. Prepare a sewing thread. This is an ordinary sewing machine. The thread we usually use, the color of this thread. I personally suggest it to be quite different from the color of the fabric. For example, I'm using white fabric here. Then you should stop using white thread because it is easy to mistake it for a loose end when you turn it over and you might pull it off or cut it off. Then, when we are officially sewing and you are about to reach this corner, you should stop 1 stitch before it. After stopping, we open the 2 pieces of fabric and place the thread in the middle. Pull both ends of the thread tightly with both hands simultaneously. At this moment, our needle is inserted into the fabric, so our thread will be caught by the needle. In this state, we move forward 1 stitch. This stitch must reach exactly the tip point. If some of you are not confident in reaching this point precisely, then manually lift the presser foot and turn the hand wheel slightly. Let the position of the last stitch be exactly at this sharp point. At this time, our needle is still in the fabric. Then we pull both ends of the thread tight. Pull it outward a bit. If our operation is correct, then the thread is already behind the needle. Originally, it was in front. Now it is behind. If you pull it outward like this, directly pulling it out indicates that there is a problem with your operation. Next, we simultaneously pinch both ends of the thread and hide it to the back on the left. So when we continue sewing later, we won't step on this thread end. Therefore, you need to calculate where to hide it. Then rotate the fabric and continue sewing the remaining part. Finally, we need to trim the seam at the right angle position. Trim it diagonally. Be careful when trimming. There is a line at this right angle position. We must be careful not to cut this line. If there are no issues, we can turn it over. Be sure to pay attention when turning it over. We need to pull both ends of this line tightly at the same time. Pull it outwards. Pull out this right angle. You must not pull only one end of the line. If you only pull one end of the line is likely to be pulled out. You must pull both ends at the same time. Finally, we remove this line. By pulling only one end, you can pull out this line. This episode's skirt, tang. We are using hard tulle fabric. This tulle is relatively harder. Its support effect will be better. If you like skirts and don't want them,
Here we will make a sewing box for the embroidery cage. First, we make a few notches on this edge. This is on the lining. Do not cut the notches too deep. Fold it inward. Fold inward. While folding, scrape it with your fingernail to shape it. After finishing the inward fold, we take the inside part. The seam on the cuff of our outer layer should be pulled slightly outward to align with the inner layer and can be temporarily fixed in place. There is a place with a sharp seam above, then align it with the sharp seam on the surface. Here is a side seam. The bottom side seam should also be aligned with the inside side seam. Be careful not to prick your hand. Now let's start stitching. When we stitch to the surface, it must be on this seam. Make sure not to pierce through the surface fabric itself. Otherwise, you will see it when you turn it over to the front. I am now on this seam, on the surface seam. On the surface seam, I have inserted a stitch, then we pass the needle through directly to the inner folded edge. Give it a stitch. If you are good at using the long stitch method, you can use the long stitch method. It will look a bit more aesthetically pleasing. If you're not good at it, using this method is also fine. Stitch through once. Above is the inner part, then below is the outer part's seam. Repeat like this. Okay, after sewing one round, just tie a knot here. If we sew it onto the surface, the thread will be visible at the edge. So we can't sew it onto the surface, we can only sew it onto the seam. This way it's done. Together our sleeves do not have inner weights added, so here we need to slightly adjust the inside seam position. For those with better skills, you can directly move the seam inward here. Fold it inward and make some notches. If you are a beginner, I suggest following my video tutorial. Here we cut a piece of thin interfacing and align it face to face with this position. Note that one side of the fusible interfacing is adhesive. We will smooth it out. The non-adhesive side is designated as the front. If you don't have fusible interfacing and don't plan to buy it, you can directly use a piece of this copper-colored lining fabric. It's the same. The benefit of using fusible interfacing is that after we finish, we can press it to make the fusible interfacing and the fabric stick together and become one unit. It will definitely be flatter and more aesthetically pleasing. After determining the best position, we will directly sew along the style line of the cage. After sewing, use pinking shears to trim the style. If you don't have pinking shears, use regular scissors. Make some notches at the curved areas. Then we will turn the fabric with the interfacing to the reverse side of the main fabric. You can use a tailor's ham to press it, or you can scrape it with your fingernail, like I do. If you are using a pressing iron, be sure to pay attention to only press this small folded area, and do not press too far inward, as the excess interfacing will need to be trimmed off later. After folding, we process along the edge at a position of about 1 millimeter to the visible line. Fix it here. After removing, the excess fusible inner lining on both sides here can be trimmed off, then turn it to the reverse side. Leave about 5 millimeters of fusible inner lining, and trim off the excess part as well. Then we use the iron to lightly press this part. In this step, we will see the difference between using fusible interfacing and using regular fabric, because if we use fusible interfacing, we press it like this. It is bonded together with the fabric underneath, which will make it smoother. After we finish